Good day. Today is Thursday, 6th March 2025, and I make this programme as European leaders are again meeting. This has been the third big meeting of European leaders over the course of about the last 2 weeks now, 3 weeks now. European leaders are again meeting with President Zelensky of Ukraine again present as they try to sift through and work out a strategy in light of the momentous changes that are currently underway with the shift in policy and language from the United States, a shift which is clear that European governments had not prepared themselves for. Now, even as this meeting begins, and as of the time of making of this programme, it has not yet started, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has made another very interesting statement. And here I should say that Marco Rubio seems to have an interesting role in this administration, in that very quietly and without a huge amount of attention, he says things which are obviously true and which are in fact momentous, but he does so in a quiet way which somehow manages to slip under the radar. So a couple of weeks ago, shortly after President Trump's inauguration, he gave an interview to Megyn Kelly in which he quite blandly and casually said that the unipolar moment had ended, that period had been an aberration in human history, burying forever the whole concept of the end of history and all of that, that the United States was once again one great power in a multipolar system in which there are other great powers, Russia and China, and all three of the great powers pursue their interests, as must the United States also do. So that was a dramatic shift in attitude and perspective on the part of the United States. It went completely against the entire policy and intellectual direction underpinning American policy since the George W. Bush era, since the end of the Cold War. Here we had the US Secretary of State saying, as I said, quite calmly, quite casually, without, as I said, anybody seemingly paying much attention, that the whole idea of unipolarity, of globalism, of US hegemony, as we have previously understood it, is over. The United States remains a great power. In fact, it is the preeminent great power, still the most powerful country in the world, but it is once again just one great power alongside three. So that was a momentous shift, a colossal change of direction. And by the way, it remains surprising to me that even now, all those weeks since Marco Rubio said those words, they continue to attract so little attention. I've not seen them properly discussed anywhere in European media, for example. I've barely seen them discussed or reported in the United States itself. And most extraordinary of all, there's been remarkably little pushback against them. So that was one momentous thing that Marco Rubio said. But now he's come forward and he said something else. He's now straightforwardly confirmed that the war in Ukraine was a proxy war between Russia and the United States, that the United States was in effect engaging in a proxy war against Russia. Now, of course, the Russians have been saying that for a very, very long time. In fact, they made it clear that that is what they thought the whole conflict was. even before the conflict actually started. When I say the conflict, I mean the military part of the conflict, with the start of the special military operation 3 years ago in February 2022. But of course, in the West, it has been absolute heresy to utter those sort of words. Doing so was seen as adopting a Putin talking point, that this was a Russian idea. What was happening was not a proxy war, it was an act of unprovoked aggression by Russia against a country, Ukraine, a peaceful country, which the Western powers were assisting in defending itself. No word of it being a proxy war as such. Now, of course, this has been always nonsense. We've had statements early on in the conflict by people like US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin coming forward and saying that the purpose of the war was to weaken Russia, for example. We've had other, not that different comments from other US and indeed European officials. We've had people like the High Representative for Foreign Affairs in the European Union, Kaja Kallas, recently talk about what a great idea it would be if Russia could be broken up into lots of small countries. A view, by the way, which is not quite as marginal in the West as some like to suppose. There have been lots of discussions of this sort of thing in various websites and think tanks and that sort of thing. But anyway, overall, the line has held. It's not a proxy war. We're not at war with Russia. Not in any conceivable way are we at war with Russia. We're simply helping Ukraine defend itself against Russian aggression. And here is Marco Rubio, and he comes along and he says straightforwardly that, in fact, this is a proxy war after all. And again, I've seen a few eyebrows raised in Europe. It's tucked away in one or two small places. There was a brief article about it, I think, in the Daily Telegraph in London. But overall, these words have not attracted anywhere near the level of attention that they merit. Now, can I just say, not only is this a proxy war, I would go much further than that. The Vietnam War, the war that was fought in the 1960s and 1970s, was a kind of proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States was involved in that war. It was fighting the North Vietnamese, the communist North Vietnamese, and the North Vietnamese allies in South Vietnam, the so-called Viet Cong. The Soviet Union and China, but were backing the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong in that war. That was a proxy war. That was a very, very big proxy war. If you worked your way through all of the other many regional conflicts that took place during the Cold War period, many of them were also proxy wars. I remember that there was a major proxy war, a conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, for example, in the late 1970s in the Horn of Africa. The Western powers were quietly backing Somalia, and the Soviet Union was then backing Ethiopia. And there was a war then, and it was fought between the Ethiopians and the Somalis, and as I said, the superpowers were each supporting different parties in that conflict. Well, I don't think you can really say that about the conflict in Ukraine. If we look at what has been happening, if we look at, for example, the many articles that have appeared in the West, the many commentaries about the effect on the war of the cut-off in American military supplies to Ukraine, the cut-off of intelligence support by the United States, all of those sort of things, and look at so many other things that we have learnt about the conduct of the war over the last 3 years, then we can see that it is actually a lot more than just the kind of proxy war that we were familiar with from the Cold War era. Because it's absolutely clear to me that the collective West, but first and foremost the United States, was not just engaged in what you might call a proxy war. It was providing Ukraine with the intelligence it needed to conduct the war. It was providing the intelligence, it was increasingly providing the military equipment, or it was getting its European allies to provide the military equipment. All Ukrainian brigades, the ones that are now formed and which are thrown into the battle, appear to be all but exclusively equipped now with equipment supplied by the collective West. This includes even Soviet-era equipment, most of which now comes from stockpiles, the remaining stockpiles in Eastern Europe left over from the era of the Warsaw Pact. The United States was also providing the battlefield communications relied upon by the Ukrainians through the Starlink system. It was drawing up the plans for the military operations. We now know an awful lot about the role the United States and Britain in particular played in organising Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive. In fact, there's even a painting, apparently, of General Milley with the plans for the advance on the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. There by his side, this painting, this picture, this portrait, which apparently he posed for, was supposed to be apparently displayed, presumably in the offices of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, of which he was chair. I presume he posed for that portrait before the disastrous failure of that summer 2023 offensive. But in effect, he's declaring in that portrait his ownership of it. And in fact, we know now to a great extent that was indeed how that offensive was indeed planned and directed. It was planned and to a great extent directed by the West. We've had reports in the Ukrainian media discussing how the British played an absolutely pivotal role in organising Ukraine's disastrous counterattack across the Dnieper River into Kherson, east of the Dnieper, the amphibious operation that ended disastrously with the Battle of Krinky. The Western powers, far from having a hands-off involvement in the war, were deeply involved in every aspect of it. They were paying the soldiers, they were paying the officers, they were paying the civil servants who were supporting the home front back in Ukraine. They were running the war almost completely. Now, this was not what happened during the Vietnam War, by way of example. I've read extensively the story about that particular war, and if we're talking about the assistance that the Soviet Union and China gave to the North Vietnamese, it never came anywhere close to approaching this all-spectrum assistance that the Western powers have been providing to Ukraine. And of course it went beyond that, because in the spring of last year, as we now know, the Western powers also took the decision to start launching missiles into Russian territory, the Russians have discussed in many places how this was an act of war, how those missiles could not be launched into Russian territory without the direct involvement of the Western powers, something which no one has ever denied and which has now been implicitly admitted. After the switching off, the turning off of American intelligence to Ukraine, the headline in the Daily Telegraph was America, Trump switches off Ukrainian missiles. The Ukrainians cannot launch missiles without the direct involvement, hands-on involvement of the United States. They had to identify the targets, provide the Ukrainians with the real-time intelligence, and in terms of strikes inside Russia itself, given the fact that GPS does not work in Russia, they had to provide all of the other targeting data that only the Americans are able to do. And fascinatingly, this article in the Daily Telegraph acknowledged that this turning off of American intelligence information also prevents Ukraine from launching its Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles. Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles supplied by Britain and France. Exactly as the Russians said, these missiles depend on American data inputs. Without them, they simply cannot be used. And it seems it goes beyond that. I've been reading comments by Ukrainian officials in which they admit that Ukraine's drone offensive, such as it is, also depends very heavily on American help. Without the Americans, the Ukrainians can perhaps launch drones against the big industrial facilities inside Russia up to a certain point. But in terms of striking at Russian military formations, including inside Russia itself, they can't do that without the Americans either. I'm going to say, by the way, that in terms of the big drone offensives against Russian territory, I suspect that the Americans are deeply involved in those as well. I think that without American assistance, the Ukrainians aren't able to control and organize the drones and deploy them in various places and make sure that they reach targets and bypass Russian air defenses and all that sort of thing. So this has been a war which has been waged in effect by the collective West. And yes, the Ukrainians have played an absolutely key role. They have been the people who have been providing the manpower on the battle lines. Ukrainian role in the war has been to fight and die. But every other part of it has been run, in effect, by the West. Seeing this war in that way gives a certain understanding of it. We're not looking here at a mere conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We're not even looking at a proxy war in which the superpowers each back different proxies, or one side supports an ally against the other. We're looking at, in effect, a kind of disguised war between the West and the Russians, in which the West does everything that is normally done in a war. It supplies the ammunition, it provides the targeting, it does the command and control, it provides the communications, it provides the intelligence, it takes responsibility for the logistics. It does all of those things except actually provide the infantry that is doing the fighting, the actual fighting. If one thinks of this, not so much as a proxy war, but rather as a war in which the Russians have been fighting a coalition of enemies. A coalition of enemies in which the various parties within the coalition are each assigned different roles. So the Ukrainians provide the infantry, but the Americans and the Western powers provide everything else. Then the war becomes much easier to understand. And of course, the tensions between the Americans and the Russians and the West and the Russians become much easier to understand as well. And of course, and this is again very different from the proxy wars that were fought during the Cold War, this is also a full spectrum economic war as well. The Western powers have done things which normally would only be done during an actual war. They've seized property and goods of the citizens of the enemy state. Sometimes the Russians are almost represented openly in the media as if they are enemies. There have been restrictions on travel of enemy citizens. They can't travel in the territory of the belligerent countries, thus the closing of air links. There have been attempts to restrict supplies of strategic materials. There have even been attempts to establish what might be called economic blockades. And economic blockades are, of course, a common part of war. The British perfected them during the wars of the 18th century and the Napoleonic Wars. Just saying. And the Western powers used that kind of policy of economic blockade against Germany during the two world wars. Just saying. So, and of course, the Western powers have also done radical and extraordinary things, such as seize the assets of the Russian central bank and freeze them. And of course, we've had long discussions and debates in the West, which have now resumed with a vengeance, by the way, over the last couple of days, not just of seizing the assets, but of confiscating them, of declaring them Western property. Something, again, which normally is only done during wars, but which it looks as if the European powers are now on the brink of doing. So, Rubio has carried out a conceptual breakthrough. He has said that this is a proxy war. But if you're really going to understand the war and the way the war has been fought and why the war has been so protracted, then you begin to understand the kind of war that it really is and the way in which this war should be described. And here I'm going to make one further observation before I move on, which is that, of course, one is always, when one does these programs, every so often someone comes along and makes the point that there must be something wrong with the Russians, that they're taking so long to win the war, or there must be something particularly amazing about the Ukrainians that they've been able to keep fighting so successfully and for as long as they have. Well, I mean, there may be some truth to this, but if one understands that this is a war where the Russians have been fighting the collective West, where it has been a war between Russia, if you like, and a coalition of countries, in which Ukraine is only one member of that coalition. Well, the answer to that question about why this war is taking so long basically answers itself. It's not just Russia versus Ukraine. If it had been Russia versus Ukraine alone, as is being admitted now all across the media in the West, well, the war would have ended a long time ago, almost certainly in 2022, probably sometime around the autumn. And people are now, of course, saying that without American assistance, Ukraine cannot continue the war much longer than for a few more months. The Russians, by the way, are being a lot more careful. But Anyway, the point is that, again, that is in a sense an admission that it is the fact that this is a coalition war which has, to a great extent, explained its duration. This is a coalition war which has never openly declared itself to be that. The Western countries, the Americans, the Europeans constantly have gone through the pretense that they're not at war with Russia, even as they do things which are equivalent to belligerence in a war. They've even been talking recently about seizing Russian ships on the high seas, for example. Well, as I said, we now see the hollowness of falsity of those sort of claims. It seems that someone at some point in the West hit upon this brilliant idea of how to fight a war against Russia without straightforwardly admitting that one was doing so and avoiding all-out escalation into a nuclear exchange. And, well, this is how it was done. Now, the key thing to understand is that this war has failed. This great coalition, which is not by any means, by the way, the first Western coalition that has thrown itself against Russia. There have been many. Napoleon led one. A certain gentleman in Berlin led another one. As I said, this is just another one of those coalitions. That coalition is now facing defeat. They began to see this defeat, they began to sense that this defeat was coming after the fall of Avdiivka a year ago. And of course, the events of 2024 have increasingly led in that direction. And in the face of that defeat, we have seen that the major country that has been the most important member of this coalition, the country which ultimately initiated this war in the first place, the country, however, which is in a best position to disengage from it, is now taking the first very tentative steps to do so, to find a way out of the war before a conclusive defeat comes. Now, I'm going to make a few quick observations about the state of the war at the moment on the front lines before I move on. The first thing to say is that the apparently continuing Russian advances across the conflict line, the Russians have been steadily tightening their noose around the Ukrainian troops in Sudzha. I think it is more appropriate now to talk about the Sudzha pocket inside Russia as opposed to the Kursk pocket inside Russia. Group of forces north have been describing the military situation in Kursk region. They talk about a situation where the Ukrainians in Malaya Lochnia, north of Sudzha, are now coming under increasing pressure. It looks as if the Russians captured the village of Lebedeva, north east of Svedlikovo, some days ago, and are close, therefore, to severing the road from Sudzha to Malaya Lochnia. It's likely the Ukrainians will withdraw from Malaya Lochnia and try to concentrate on Sudzha, at least that's my guess. But anyway, even the supply lines to the Sudzha pocket, to the Sudzha itself, are now under increasing pressure. And the Russians, as I said, have been closing on these supply lines from multiple directions. Now, at the Duran, we were recently privileged to do a program with Patrick Lancaster, the intrepid reporter who has been reporting from the battle lines throughout the entire duration of the conflict, going back before the start of the special military operation. He's recently been in the vicinity of Belogorovka, the small village or town close to Lysychansk, and he is saying that it looks as if the Russians have finally and comprehensively secured Belogorovka. Now, I'm getting a lot of information about Belogorovka from various sources, and I've quite openly and straightforwardly acknowledged that I've completely misunderstood this battle. There have been previous reports from the Russians suggesting that they'd captured Belogorovka. Supposedly they did that in 2022. And I seem to remember that the Russian Defense Ministry reported that they had done so as well some months ago, even as they've reported the recapture of Belogorovka a couple of days ago. It seems that this has never quite been the case. Belogorovka itself is part of a very complex fortified area, and I've not just had this from Patrick Lawrence, but Lancaster, by the way, but from various other sources. Fairly elaborate fortified positions were created there, including a network of tunnels. These apparently connected with the slag heap, which was also a fortified position as well. And this territory, not just the village, but all of these fortified positions around it, have never at any time been properly secured by the Russians. And it has been the inability of the Russians to secure this position that has prevented them from moving forward towards Siversk, which is the town further to the west that they ultimately want to capture. And in a program that we did on the Duran about Belogorovka, Patrick Lancaster compared the fortifications in Belogorovka, their complexity and sophistication, to the ones that the Ukrainians had created around Avdiivka. But another comment that I've seen has compared them perhaps rather more accurately to the village of Pesky, which formed part of the fortified lines that the Ukrainians had created around the city of Donetsk, and which the Russians finally captured in August 2022. And, well, this explains the protracted and very, very difficult nature of the battle there. But the Russians have now captured Belogorovka, and probably they've been able to do that because Russian advances in other directions along the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, in places like that, in Kharkiv region, the Russian capture of Bakhmut and Soledar further south, the recent capture by the Russians of the village of Yampolovka at the southern end of the Zherebets river, probably means that the Ukrainians have not been able to keep up the supplies to their troops in Belogorovka. And this battle has been a lot more difficult, a lot more protracted, a lot more complex, and a lot more intense than I had understood. And, well, it seems that it is now finally over, and that it will be an important staging point in the battles which are to come. Anyway, that is what I understand. And there have also been reports, yesterday in fact, from the Russians that with Andreevka, the entire Andreevka fortified area having collapsed, with the Russians having now cleared more of the villages west of Velikaya Novosilka, the Russians are now in a position to advance westwards towards the Dnieper in this area, because there are in effect no more defense lines for them to capture. Now, this has been, again, a long, difficult battle, but the Russians have finally, apparently, according to these reports, they finally reached that point in the battle for this territory where they've finally got through the great Ukrainian fortified lines that had been established and which had slowed progress for so long. Well, again, to repeat, I am not there, but it looks as if that might indeed be the position. So, well, we'll see what happens and how this battle plays out and whether it is indeed correct what the Russians indeed are saying. Anyway, that's the information I have. The internet, by the way, continues to be filled with claims about Ukrainian counterattacks towards Kotlino, which the Ukrainians, I understand, have now claimed again to have captured or recaptured. There have been more claims about Ukrainian attacks in Toretsk, which the Ukrainians have boxed themselves into attacking because they told the Daily Telegraph, the Western media, a few weeks ago that they still controlled it, or at least controlled part of it. What I understand is happening is that the Ukrainians are indeed attacking these places and are suffering incredibly heavy losses in doing so, that they're in effect refighting the same battle that they have already lost and doing so again and again and again. Anyway, let's move on and discuss other things. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about what the Americans are going to do. The most interesting observations that have been made, the most interesting reports that have been made, which I think really clarify the American position, is that the Americans have apparently reached out to some of Zelensky's opponents inside Kiev, and they've not apparently contacted Zelensky in London. I think that they've concluded that Zelensky is an unreliable player and perhaps that he's too close to the British and the Europeans, but that they have contacted Yulia Tymoshenko, former Prime Minister of Ukraine, the so-called gas princess, a very ambitious Ukrainian politician who for a time looked as if she might make a successful bid for Ukraine's leadership, and someone, by the way, who historically had a strong and friendly connection with Vladimir Putin. The two met several times. At a personal level, they appear to have got on. Tymoshenko negotiated a gas deal with the Russians that the Ukrainians subsequently repudiated. She was jailed for doing that. There's been lots of commentaries in the West about how she was jailed, and the blame has always been visited on the Ukrainian president that was overthrown in February 2014, Viktor Yanukovych. In fact, the prosecution against Tymoshenko was launched by Yanukovych's pro-Western predecessor, Viktor Yushchenko, and the pretext for the entire prosecution, and in my opinion, it went a little more than a pretext. There were aspects of the case which I thought were unfavourable to Tymoshenko, but I'm not going to relitigate that case in this program. Anyway, the point of the launch point of that prosecution was a deal, a gas deal that Tymoshenko negotiated directly in Moscow with Vladimir Putin, cutting out both Yushchenko, the Ukrainian president, and Yanukovych, Yushchenko's opponent. So Tymoshenko might be an intriguing possibility for a new Ukrainian leader who might just possibly be able to work with the Russians and come to terms with them. It's also worth pointing out that during the many elections that took place in Ukraine before the Maidan coup, or revolution if you prefer, in the various elections, central Ukraine, the small towns and villages around Kiev, the area basically to the west of the Dnieper River, but not including the western fringe, Galicia and those places, Lvov and those places. This area, what you might call core Ukraine, the part of Ukraine which both the Russians and the Americans might want to keep separate or independent, but which the Russians might want ultimately to re-establish friendly contacts with. This large region, the biggest single, politically, the biggest single region of Ukraine, was the area that lent Tymoshenko the most support. This was her political base. It was her electoral base was in this area. So the Americans have approached Tymoshenko and they've tried to discuss possible ways forward with her. And Tymoshenko was also, of course, present. She was in Washington, D.C. on the day of Donald Trump's inauguration, and she was actually physically present in the room in the Capitol where Donald Trump was actually inaugurated. She was one of the invited guests. So it's understandable that the Americans would reach out to her. Now, publicly, Tymoshenko has said that she doesn't think that elections are an appropriate thing at the present time. But if there's a ceasefire, or perhaps alternatively, if Zelensky can be, shall we say, persuaded to resign and leave Ukraine, then presumably the stopgap leader would be the leader of the Speaker of the Rada, the Ukrainian Parliament. He might conceivably come to some kind of ceasefire agreement. This is the American plan. Ceasefire agreement with the Russians. Elections might then take place. Tymoshenko might win those elections. That might be the American game plan. Tymoshenko would then be the president, and she would go ahead and sign the deal with the Russians. My own view is that the Russians have somebody completely different in mind for the eventual leader of Ukraine, and that is Viktor Medvedchuk. But they have worked with Tymoshenko before, and if Tymoshenko were to come forward and start to lead Ukraine in that way, well, they too might take a step back and think of possibilities. Now, it seems that the Americans did speak to others as well. They spoke to Poroshenko as well. This is the former president of Ukraine. Trump probably knows him because Poroshenko was president of Ukraine for part of the period when Trump was president during his first term. Just saying. But against that, Poroshenko, though he's spoken about the fact that he knows how to end the war, is probably irretrievably damaged goods as far as the Russians are concerned. He, after all, was the person who basically agreed to the Minsk agreement and who then went back on it. So it might be that Poroshenko might be acceptable to the Americans, but the Russians probably will tell the Americans if this idea is ever floated past them, that they absolutely do not want to have any kind of dealings or contacts with him. They've negotiated with him in the past. They found that an impossible undertaking. They don't want to return to that with Poroshenko either. My own guess is that the Americans are mostly thinking about Tymoshenko rather than Poroshenko. And their contacts with Poroshenko is an attempt to go through the motions. But anyway, this is clearly now what I think the American game plan is. Now, the Americans have paused military supplies to Ukraine. They have stopped providing intelligence to Ukraine. They've stopped providing most civilian financial assistance to Ukraine. Some intelligence is still probably leaking out. There's been an interesting article about this from Simplicius the Thinker, who says that Ukraine can still get intelligence from NATO. NATO is still conducting flights around Ukrainian territory. It's still relaying information to Ukraine. It's been fascinating, by the way, again, over the last 24, 36 hours, to finally read confirmation in the Western media that all of these Western aircraft that have been flying close to Ukraine, all of those drones, the Global Hawks and all of that, were indeed providing intelligence information to Ukraine. Anyway, a lot of that is still continuing. Not all of it, but some of it is. And Ukraine is still obviously getting information. And as I said, the British look like they're trying to get round the Americans. They're providing information to Ukraine from their so-called assets inside Ukraine. They're spies embedded within the Ukrainian political system, just to say. Anyway, the British are playing that game. By the way, I've had an email reminder, I get to say it, from Eve Smith, always that very shrewd and acute observer of Ukrainian things, in which she pointed out that one of the great whistleblower revelations of the last couple of years was that GCHQ used to do bulk surveillance of Americans on behalf of the US intelligence community, thereby circumventing US laws that prohibited that kind of thing. I'm assuming that still does go on, and it does indeed give the British significant leverage over the Americans, on the assumption that the US intelligence community wants that kind of bulk surveillance to continue. Maybe the Trump team, by the way, have different views about this. I mean, they've shown deep skepticism about a lot of what the US intelligence community has been doing. And of course, Donald Trump himself, as we know, was also placed under surveillance. And this appears to have happened, as he claimed, by the way, during the 2015 and 2016 election campaigns. Just saying. So, anyway, intelligence continues to be provided to Ukraine through all of these circuitous routes. So the Americans are trying to stop, however, the provision of most of the intelligence to Ukraine. They're cutting off military supplies. They're cutting off all sorts of things like that kind. They're saying that this has not really been stopped permanently. This is just a pause. They're doing it because they can't go on supplying Ukraine with weapons and intelligence and all that kind of thing in a way that will prolong the war, because America's objective is to try to bring the war to an end, to end the war as soon as possible. And indeed, Donald Trump said on Truth Social that Zelensky, talking about the fact that he wants the war to go on and on and on, he's only able to do that. He believes he can do that because he's got the backing of the United States to continue the war in that way. And for that reason, the United States must stop providing him with that kind of backing. And that's what the Americans are doing in order to supposedly bring Zelensky to heel, to get Zelensky to negotiate. And, well, we've seen comments by John Radcliffe, the CIA director, reiterating again that this is all ultimately a pause, and hopefully that Zelensky will come to his senses and will come forward and will move forward and start serious negotiations with the Russians in order to achieve peace, as the Americans want. And that as soon as that happens, well, the Americans will be able to resume at least some military assistance, because Zelensky then shows that he is indeed serious about peace. Now, I have to say straight away that this is actually completely illogical, and it is strange that people are not seeing that. The person who's come closest to seeing how completely illogical that formula is, that we pause military aid in order to get Zelensky to negotiate, and then resume military aid when Zelensky says that he will negotiate. The only person I've seen who's seen how illogical that is in fact Simplicius, the thinker. You'll find that in his latest Substack blog. And of course, we go back to the original point. If Zelensky comes to the Americans and says, yes, I'm going to negotiate, I need your intelligence, I need your military supplies, I can't go on without them, you obviously want me to negotiate with the Russians, and I'm going to therefore negotiate with the Russians. Well, assuming this pause in aid is what's going to drive him to the negotiating table, then as soon as that pause in aid is lifted, he will probably or presumably turn around and say, well, the Russians are being obstructive in the negotiations. I'm not going to continue with the negotiations anymore. The Americans are giving me aid again, just as they were previously. So I can just therefore go back and carry on with the war. And can you please give me another $10 billion and 40 more tanks and 300 more missiles and all that kind of thing. So as a policy, actually, it doesn't really make a huge amount of sense unless the Americans are prepared to stop aid all over again. Maybe they are, but it begins to look in that case as if the Americans themselves are dithering and that they can't make a final decision whether to stop aid or continue to provide aid. It would make a spectacle of the United States itself. Either you stop aid or you don't. You can't turn it on and off like a tap without making yourself, in the end, appear ridiculous. It ultimately is an unsustainable position. And it simply will not impress the Russians. The Russians will say, well, you are not ultimately serious about this. You say that you want to stop the aid, but ultimately and in reality you don't. You are still arming our adversary, and why should we therefore take seriously your claims that you want to move forward with negotiations? Anyway, I think that what the Americans really want is not Zelensky to come to the table. I think that the Americans, having seen Zelensky and heard him, having seen him close up, have come to the view that he is impossible, that he will never negotiate in good faith, and they basically want him to leave the scene. And their real objective is to put the squeeze to the point when he finally steps down. And this explains their outreach to people like Tymoshenko. Now, I've already discussed what I think the problem with that is. Removing Zelensky from his position as president of Ukraine would have been, I suspect, a reasonably achievable thing to have done a year ago, at the time when his constitutional term ended. But over the period since then, Zelensky has been accepted as the legitimate president of Ukraine, including by the United States. He's had the unstinting support of the Biden administration and of the Europeans. He is still getting the support of the Europeans. And he's used the time since then to basically disperse and intimidate his various opponents. Zelensky is in effect in exile in London. Poroshenko has had all his accounts frozen. He's not even apparently able to go into cafes and order a cup of coffee because his cards don't work. There's a report that actually says that. So Poroshenko isn't able to do that anymore. Klitschko, as I said, is a spent force, in my opinion. And, well, Tymoshenko is an intriguing possibility, but she has not been a strong figure in Ukrainian politics for a long time. And it will take an awful lot of work to bring her back to prominence and to the attention of the Ukrainian public. And she has many, many enemies in Ukraine. And she doesn't seem to me, for the moment, to be someone who is in a position, to say it frankly, who's able to launch a political strike against Zelensky, even if the Americans are backing her. So, at some point, the Americans are going to have to confront this. If they want to pursue negotiations, they have to face the fact that Zelensky's probably still going to be there, and he doesn't want negotiations. He wants to continue the war. And that's clearly what the Americans don't want. But removing him is going to be all but impossible. So what do? Do they press forward with negotiations and keep their fingers crossed and hope that it's all going to work out in the end? Or do they do what the Europeans are afraid they will do? Finally throw up their hands in the air and walk away? Or will they end up doing what some in Europe still hope they will do and realise that Zelensky cannot be removed but won't negotiate peace, and that the Russians are not going to compromise, and therefore pivot back to the European position and recommit to the war, giving the Europeans the backstop for their peacekeeping forces that the Europeans are demanding, or giving the Ukrainians, or promising the Ukrainians security guarantees, taking steps, in other words, that are guaranteed to bring the negotiations with the Russians to a juddering stop and keep going with the war, resume the arms supplies and the intelligence sharing, continue where the Biden administration left off, and hope for the best, that the Russian economy breaks down, or that Putin has an accident and falls under a bus, or that the Russian army suddenly exhausts itself and collapses, or something of that kind. Well, that is the big question going forward. Which of these three positions will America take? And I don't myself have the answer to that, though if I had to make a guess, I would say in the end it will probably be the second, that the Americans will wash their hands and walk away when they realise that Zelensky is not going to go, that he's not going to seek peace, and that the option of sticking with the Europeans is an option not for victory, but for defeat. But anyway, we shall see. In the meantime, the Europeans, of course, are having their great meeting, and, well, they're all coming together, all of them. And again, there's all sorts of fighting talk and all of that, and Zelensky is there. But if you now read the articles in the media carefully, you will see that everybody quietly understands, everybody across Europe quietly understands that without the Americans, the war sooner or later is going to be lost. It's going to be lost anyway, even with the Americans. But if the Americans do stick to the position they seem inclined to take at the moment, the war is going to be lost. Ukraine in some form will fall. And, well, the big question for the Europeans is what next? Well, let's first of all try and understand what the Europeans are trying to achieve through this summit. The first is that even more important for them than avoiding defeat in Ukraine is avoiding a Russian-American understanding about the future security of Europe. I have discussed this so much in so many places that I am not going to discuss it in detail here. All I would say is that this has been the long-standing European nightmare going all the way back to the Second World War, that the Americans and the Russians will agree the future of Europe between them, and the European leaders will find themselves faced with an outcome for Europe that they can't influence and can't change, and which in effect seals some kind of Russian-American preeminence in Europe. That is their nightmare. That is what they will work to try to prevent. And if that means prolonging the war in Ukraine to do it, they will do everything they possibly can to keep the war prolonged. And that means, in the short term, doing everything possible to make sure that Vladimir Zelensky remains president of Ukraine. All of these resounding statements of support for him, all of the hugs outside Downing Street, all the greetings with Ursula von der Leyen and Emmanuel Macron and all of that, or the meeting with the King in Britain, all of this is intended to secure Zelensky's position in Kiev, to confound these American attempts to reach out and find alternatives. And in that, by the way, as I said, I think the Europeans are going to be successful. I think that they will ensure that Vladimir Zelensky remains president of Ukraine. And they're going to try and work on Zelensky because, of course, they still hope in some way to get the Americans re-engaged, to get the Americans to give the backstop to the Europeans for their peacekeeping forces, the ones that they intend to send to Ukraine. Lavrov, by the way, has again spoken out against this idea today. He has said that Russia categorically opposes this idea. A couple of days ago, the Russians carried out a massive missile strike against a military base in Ukraine. I said some days ago when I first mentioned this strike that there were reports that 150 Ukrainian soldiers had been killed. The Ukrainian media reports are now confirming that figure. That is very, very unusual indeed, by the way. That scarcely ever happens, but this time the Ukrainians are themselves acknowledging that this missile strike did indeed cause that terrible devastation to this base that we have just seen. And the Russian media is now openly saying that this missile attack was not only intended to kill all of those Ukrainian soldiers, it was also intended as a warning to the Europeans that if European troops did indeed enter Ukraine, the Russians have the means and the resolve to strike them wherever in Ukraine they might be, and that they will die in their hundreds. And can I say that if 150 British soldiers are killed as a result of a single Russian missile strike, assuming they're ever deployed to Ukraine, then that will cause a shock in Britain. And if the same thing happens to French troops sent to Ukraine, it will, I am confident, cause a similar shock in France. And though there might be a brief rallying behind the troops. I can very easily imagine if more such strikes take place and if more hundreds of British or French troops are sent back to Britain and France in body bags, what a tremendous backlash, what a fundamental shift in sentiment in Britain and France this might cause. Just saying. The Europeans, by the way, are coming up with a crazy plan. I say crazy because it is crazy. Apparently, General Breedlove, the US Air Force General, arch neocon, is supposed to be an architect of it. That in the event of a ceasefire, the British and the French, the Europeans, in effect impose a no-fly zone by themselves over Western Ukraine. It said that there's nothing really to worry about. Russian fighter jets never moved into Western Ukraine, so there's no real cause for concern. We're unlikely to see the Russians there. And of course, if the Russians start launching missiles, then the British and the French jets can shoot them down. This is an absolutely ludicrous plan. First of all, British and French fighter jets might just be able to shoot down some Russian subsonic cruise missiles like the Calibres and the KH-101s if they start being launched against Western Ukraine. But given that the Russians often launch 100 missiles at a go, and given that I understand that British and French fighter jets are only able to operate with around 4 air-to-air missiles apiece, well, you would need an awful lot of airplanes to actually shoot down all of those missiles, assuming that such a thing was possible. And do they go hunting the Uranium-2 drones as well? Do they do that night after night? The Russians apparently are soon going to be in a position to launch 500 Uranium-2 drones against Ukraine every night, night after night after night. Before long, even assuming that the Russians don't go hunting after those British and French jets, the British and the French will start running out of air-to-air missiles. Just saying. So that's one thing. The second is British and French fighter jets cannot shoot down Russian ballistic missiles like the Iskander, and they absolutely cannot shoot down Russian hypersonic missiles like the Zircon and the Kinjal. They provide no protection against those kind of missiles. They might try and chase them, but they could never effectively shoot them down. There is no capability in the West to do that. Just saying. Thirdly, if the Russians start deploying the Oreshnik missile, well, it's difficult to imagine that any Western fighter jet is going to be able to shoot down an Oreshnik missile. And of course, the devastation these missiles could cause across Ukraine would be devastating. And the Russians now have apparently launched serial production, and they're producing these missiles, according to the Ukrainians, at the rate of 25 a month. So you can do the numbers. By August, we will be looking at hundreds of Oreshnik missiles that the Russians could launch. And of course, if the Russians start launching Oreshnik missiles against the bases from which these British and French jets operate in Poland and Romania, what then? Question mark. And besides, the Russians can shoot these British and French fighter jets over Ukraine down. They can do so from territory that they control. Russian missiles, air-to-air missiles, can be extremely long-ranged, far longer ranged than any of the missiles that British and French aircraft are equipped with. And the same, by the way, applies for some of the Russian air-to-air, surface-to-air missiles, like the S-400 and some of the variants of the S-300 family as well. This is a crazy plan. It's a ludicrous plan. It is a plan that, well, only the people who thought that the ATACMS missile would change the direction of the war would come up with. And it's incredible that the advice of these people, who have proved so consistently wrong about everything, is being listened to. Anyway, the Europeans are still talking about this plan. There seems to be growing unease about it. Turkey, which has been asked to participate, issued a very, very ambiguously worded statement saying, yeah, well, we might agree, we'll think about it when and if a serious proposal is made. We're not saying we will, we're not saying we won't, we'll see. Other European states are already, again, once more distancing themselves from the proposal, and others are saying that they will only do it if the Americans are involved. And for the moment, of course, the Americans are saying that they're not involved. So this plan is probably not going to see the light of day. This plan to deploy European forces to Ukraine is not going to see the light of day. This plan to operate aircraft carrying out some kind of no-fly, imposing some kind of no-fly zone over Ukraine, that's not going to see the light of day either. By the way, incredibly, some people think that this grotesque plan, the plan to impose the no-fly zone, can take the place of peacekeepers, European peacekeepers. The Russians are certain to reject that idea outright. They're not going to accept British and French aircraft, and they will say they will shoot them down, and they're not going to accept British and French ground troops or ground troops from any NATO country and aircraft from any NATO air force. They have just again said so. So this is a ludicrous idea. So what else are the Europeans going to talk about? Well, obviously they're going to talk about Ukraine, but they have really nothing to offer. They can't replace the intelligence information the Americans have been providing. If the Americans switch off Starlink, the Europeans have no equivalent to Starlink. They're talking boastfully that they might have their own equivalent to Starlink by 2030. That is not true, by the way. It would take them, my guess is, at least a decade, probably much longer than that, given the shortage of launchers, rocket launchers. It would take them decades to get an equivalent to Starlink sorted out. The Russians probably will have something similar in a year's time. The Chinese are already working towards that. But the Europeans are in no position to get anything like that together anytime soon. And of course, even if they get it in 5 years' time, well, that is too late for the Ukrainians. And European industry cannot provide Ukraine with the weapons it needs. The German Defense Ministry issued a statement saying that Germany is now so short of weapons that it really doesn't have weapons that it can give to Ukraine any longer. The priority from this moment onward has to be rearmament. But there is something the Europeans can give to Ukraine, and I'm going to suggest that it is what Zelensky himself principally wants. They could still give him money. They don't have the unlimited pot of money that the Americans have, because the Americans run what is still the world's reserve currency. They can create money in infinite quantity and they can shovel it to Ukraine, even if they don't get congressional appropriations to authorize funding for Ukraine. I suspect we're going to discover, as DOGE does its work in the United States, that at least double the amount of the appropriations has been provided in that kind of off-the-books way that we see so commonly done in the United States today. Well, the Europeans don't have that ability, but they can still provide an awful lot. They can dress it up as loans. They can pretend that it will be repaid There is still enough money slushing around Europe to do that. You can transfer money allocated to the structural funds to Ukraine. You can use other EU funds to do it. You can cut foreign aid budgets, and you can cobble together packages from Ukraine out of that. You can still find ways to put money, to direct money at Ukraine. And then there is one other big pot of money in Europe, which is there. It's very tempting. It can be accessed to. It's in European bank accounts. That's the 240 million or whatever it is, 240 billion or whatever it is of assets, frozen assets of the Russian central bank. Of course, confiscating that money, as I discussed earlier in the program, is an act of war. But we see that if we take off the blinkers and look at this conflict as what it really is, it has been a coalition war against Russia all along. So even though legally it would be a huge step to do, it would be an act of outright theft, though it would also have huge impact around the world. It would make countries around the world seriously wonder about whether Europe is indeed a safe haven in which to put money. And the Chinese apparently are now busy sorting out their own mechanism to substitute for Euroclear. So China can provide the same service, and people in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East and Russia, all of those people could probably say to themselves, that's a much safer depository than Euroclear has turned out to be. Anyway, the Europeans are now very tempted, apparently, to seize this money. It's $300 billion. You can use that to keep Ukraine going. You can't provide Ukraine with large numbers of weapons to do that, because Europe isn't producing those weapons, and Europe's armories are empty. The United States probably will supply some weapons if they're bought in that way with this money, but then again, they might be a little reluctant to do that given the provenance of this money. Who knows? The Russians might raise issues about this in the bilateral discussions between the Americans and the Russians, and it may be that the Americans will feel that if they appear to endorse this European move, it might affect their prospects of achieving a rapprochement with the Russians. Just saying. That might make it an attractive proposition for the Europeans, however, given that they want to put that spoke in the wheel. But anyway, the Europeans might think that they can buy weapons from the United States, but the United States anyway looks more likely to want to restock its own arsenals, and there may not be that many weapons that can be bought in that way. So the Europeans can nonetheless seize that money, and even if it won't provide Ukraine with that much in the way of weapons, it can do something else. And this, I think, is what Zelensky is mostly worried about. It can provide money to him and to his friends. It can pay the salaries of the soldiers who are still fighting on the front lines. It can pay the salaries of the civil servants. It can pay off all the various power brokers in Kiev. It can enable them to close their positions and to salt some of that money away in Caribbean accounts and all of those other places where money that goes to Kiev often ends up. It can enable all of these people to buy their villas in their various places where they want to go. Maybe they're not so keen to go to the United States anymore, but hey-ho, there's always the south of France and other attractive places on the Mediterranean coast, though that might be a bit too close to Russia and Ukraine for safety. But, there's other places in the world. There's the Seychelles, there's the Turks and Caicos, who's to say? Anyway, keep the money flow going, even if you can't keep the weapons flow going. That is as important in consolidating Zelensky's position in Kiev as the weapons supplies and the intelligence supplies. Even if Zelensky can only hold out for a few more months, maybe until year's end, which, by the way, would be my likely guess, then sending all this money to Ukraine holds everything together. It means that the SBU, the people at the SBU who carry out all the arrests, they are still being paid. It means the soldiers are still being paid. It means all of those people are still being paid. And the Americans are prevented from getting their person leveraged in to take power in Kiev. Zelensky still remains, and the Americans are then still left with the three choices that I outlined before. Stick with Zelensky and hope he agrees peace. Walk away, in which case, well, it will be a clarifying moment for the Europeans, but it will have hopefully prevented the Russians and the Americans coming to a deal, which is a certain plus, or perhaps the Americans might recommit to this project after all, even if the result ultimately is a defeat. So look out and watch. The money will come probably at some point. The frozen assets will be confiscated. It looks as if we are very much heading in that direction now. There's articles all over the media here in Britain, and I believe in France as well, talking about this. And then, of course, the other thing, because if the Americans do walk away from Project Ukraine, well, that has colossal implications. I said at the start of this program that this is a coalition war against Russia, but it is a coalition war that has been lost. By far the biggest single player in that coalition, the Americans, the people whose contribution was expected to make victory certain, they have acknowledged defeat and have walked away. This is a shattering moment of revelation for the governments of Europe, for the political class of Europe. Throughout the entire post-Second World War period, throughout especially the post-Cold War period, the presumption has been that in any conflict between the collective West and the Russians, in which nuclear weapons are not used, the West would prevail because of the enormous power of the United States attached to the still considerable power of the European states. After the end of the Cold War, that assumption in the minds of European leaders became a certainty. No one in February 2022 in Europe assumed that if the United States and Europe combined against Russia in the kind of conflict which we have seen play out in Ukraine, that the Russians could prevail. So suddenly, the Europeans are confronted with the reality that despite that assumption, which, as I said, in their own minds had evolved into a certainty, they've suddenly discovered that, in fact, that certainty was wrong. There's been the coalition war, and the Russians prevailed after all. Their economy proved stronger than anyone expected. Their army proved more resilient. It was able to keep fighting in defiance of all expectations. It's not only kept fighting, it's been advancing. It's been advancing for a whole year. As I said, it's about to win its battle in Kursk region. It's broken through the last defences in southern Donbass. It's unlikely many of the European leaders have all of the details, all of the granular detail of the battles. But the fact is, they can sense that this war is being lost, despite the contribution to it of the United States. And the United States now looks as if it's rethinking its entire relationship with the Russians. So what do the Europeans do? Well, as very, very often happens, and I've discussed this in many places, many programs now, going all the way back to the mood that took hold of Europe after the fall of Avdiivka. When you have moments of panic and fear, often they alternate with moments of extreme euphoria. You have people say, well, actually the situation, it may look bad, but it's not really as bad as it looks. We've got all kinds of solutions. We can come up with all sorts of plans that will turn things round. And, well, here we are. The Germans are now coming to the rescue. They're going to abolish their debt brake. They're going to start a massive program of industrial and infrastructure expansion. They're going to rebuild their infrastructure. They're going to make their railways work again. They're going to convert their car factories into tank factories. They are going to transform the entire military political geography in Europe. And there is a strange mood of euphoria, as I said, gripping Europe, even as this plays out, even though in every conceivable respect it is absurd. When you see people in a state of euphoria, you almost always can tell that this euphoria is based on nothing. People who are really confident, who are really sure of the future, don't retreat into euphoria in the way that the Europeans are. Now, I'm going to discuss the whole situation in Germany in my next program. I'm going to say briefly that what we have seen is one of the most cynical and corrupt exercises I've ever seen in so-called democratic politics. We had an election just, 2 weeks ago, in which the party that will now be the ruling party said that it would not change the debt brake, and then within days of winning the election, they say that they intend, in effect, to abolish it. I mean, they're going to tamper with it in all kinds of ways, which in effect means that they're going to abolish it. And that same party, which swore that it would never tamper with the debt brake, it realizes that it doesn't have the majority in the Bundestag, the newly elected Bundestag, to make that change without going into some kind of arrangement with the ex-communists of Die Linke. And they don't want to do that because, of course, you must never talk to ex-communists, even though they're probably likely to agree with you. So what you do, you bring back to life the old parliament that has just been voted out of power, and you get that parliament to vote through this constitutional change, which is of enormous, momentous significance, but which is ultimately going to change the direction of Germany. As I said, the cynicism of this is beyond belief. But I'm going to discuss its effects in Germany and Europe in a different program. And I should say that Alex and I have also done a program, which no doubt will be coming out over the next couple of days, on the Duran, in which we've discussed it as well. Suffice to say that this is completely unrealistic. The idea of just turning car factories into tank factories is the sort of thing that only inky scribblers who write for newspapers and academic economists who've never been on a production line can imagine could be done, at least in any proximate space of time. But of course, it's already creating tremors across Europe, because this program of German rearmament, which will never happen, is nonetheless alarming for some European states. And the European statesman who is now most alarmed about it is, of course, our old friend, President Macron of France, who has just delivered a lunatic speech. I say that, even by Macron's standards, this speech was, beyond irrational. Russia is a deadly enemy to Europe. It will always be an enemy to Europe until it is subdued. What that means exactly, of course, he doesn't explain. Does he mean conquered? Does he mean broken up? Does he mean subjugated? Does he mean brought back to the condition it was in the 1990s? But anyway, he says that there's enormous threat to Europe. He says that Ukraine must continue to be supported until it is placed in a strong position to conduct negotiations and achieve the peace that it wants, which is, of course, exactly what Biden and Blinken and Sullivan were saying, and they've said that for 3 years, and we've seen where that led. So he provides no new thinking about Europe. But he talks now, again, about rearmament, about France being prepared to extend its nuclear umbrella across Europe, even as, of course, he insists that the French nuclear deterrent remains French. This is a crazy idea. France has no ability to replace the United States in terms of providing a nuclear umbrella for Europe. It's a very dangerous idea because, of course, he is talking about nuclear weapons. But on its own basis, what he's saying is what he's calling for is a prolonged war in Europe and an indefinite conflict with Russia. So why is he saying all of these things? Well, he won't say it, of course, but I'm going to suggest that what's really freaked him out and panicked him is German rearmament, or all the talk of it. Because France, up to now, has posed as the great military power of Europe. It's got the nuclear weapons, it's got the largest army in the EU, it's got the most powerful military industrial complex, it's the only country that makes its own fighter jets and its own nuclear powered aircraft carriers and its own nuclear submarines, which, unlike the British ones, are generally and exclusively French. And now the Germans are looking to build up their own armed forces as well. So France, Macron, have fretted over the fact that the French-German leadership of Europe has in effect degenerated into a German leadership of Europe because the Germans are so much economically stronger than the French are. But they've always said to themselves, well, we are nonetheless militarily stronger than the Germans, so on security issues we should lead. But for how much longer? If the Germans rearm, maybe they will displace us in that field as well. So let's get our word in first. Let's talk about our giant rearmament program. Let's talk about our nuclear weapons. Let's establish ourselves as the great leaders of Europe. And let's make sure that this German rearmament isn't German, that it becomes a European rearmament operation led from Brussels, where we still hope to retain some influence. And so we get this bizarre speech. Now, I've explained what I think the motives behind this are, but let's put that aside. Let's look instead at the consequences. The consequences, if this is seen through, will be disastrous for Europe. Macron is talking about unending confrontation with Russia. Well, it is impossible. It cannot last Without the Americans, it definitely cannot be sustained. There's talk in all sorts of places that this summit, this European Leaders Summit, is the summit to prepare for the end of NATO. I'm going to suggest that it is not the summit to prepare for the end of NATO. It is more likely to be the requiem, not just of NATO, but of the whole European enterprise as it has evolved, not just over the last 30 years, but for much longer. Anyway, more from me soon. This is where I have to end the program today. I'll be picking up on all of these themes in my next program, but this is where I have to finish. This has been already a very long video. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button if you like this video, and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.